Welcome to another episode of our video series of The Critique of Modern Systems.
Hello. It's great to be back. Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Eager to get into today's topic. It feels foundational.
It really does. The materials we're looking at today feel monumental. We're not just talking about policy or politics, are we? We're digging into the operating system of civilization itself.
Indeed. We're shifting our lens from, say, 4-year political cycles to the much larger timeline of societal coherence.
Absolutely. And that's our mission today, to really analyze this profound link between a society's capacity for sustained collective memory and its actual level of development.
Yeah.
We're going beyond GDP, beyond population size.
We're arguing that the real metric is your collective memory cycle.
Exactly.
I mean, think about it. If a society can hold a 1,000-year memory, learning from its deep past, well, it's truly developed. But if it operates on a one-month cycle where it forgets what happened last Tuesday,
then it's perpetually underdeveloped. It doesn't matter how much material wealth it has.
and that's our starting point. We need to look at why some societies struggle with this, how it forces them onto this inefficient historical path, and maybe what cognitive and cultural tools are needed to build a memory that lasts.
Okay, so let's start with that first paradox you mentioned, population versus sustainability. The sources point out that many highly populated countries are often called less developed.
Right, and that's not just about, a lack of resources. It's much deeper.
It is. It's the difference between just existing inside the same borders versus having the cultural framework and the organizational capacity to actually thrive together.
That requires a shared history of lessons learned. You can't just throw millions of people together and expect it to work without that cohesive memory. Without it, the population size just becomes a strain.
So the glue holding it all together is collective memory. It's like the institutional brain.
That's the perfect term for it. It's the mechanism that lets a society say, wait a minute, we tried this exact policy 5 years ago and it was a disaster. Let's not do that again.
And without that voice, every crisis feels like the first time it's ever happened. Which brings us to this fascinating idea of the helical path.
This is a huge insight. When you look at the archives, you see this pattern. Progress is made, but then there's a regression.
A circling back.
Yes, because the lessons weren't truly internalized. The collective memory failed. So the society just lurches forward, then slides back, then lurches forward again.
It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. It's not a straight line of development at all. It's a spiral. And it is profoundly inefficient. You're just burning resources, reliving the same mistakes.
And that inefficiency, that constant churn, it directly impacts your global standing. It connects right to this idea of soft power.
Okay, so let's define our terms. Hard power is the obvious stuff. Tanks, armies, economic muscle.
Right. But soft power, that's your civilization's lasting contribution to humanity.
The stuff that ends up in museums.
The stuff that ends up in museums, in textbooks, in philosophy. It's your art, your science, your legal structures. It's the value you add to the world.
And the sources draw this really sharp contrast between cultures with, deep roots and millennia of accumulated memory versus newer civilizations.
Correct. And that soft power, which is born from memory, is how you project influence. Even when wars end, the cultural friction, the civilizational rivalry, it can persist for centuries. Just look at the French and the Germans. The overt conflict is managed, but the cultural contestation is still very much alive.
So this memory failure isn't just inefficient, it can be actively exploited. Which brings us to the question, who benefits when a society forgets? How is memory manipulated in the short term?
This is where we get into the really modern stuff, the use of media, politics, and technology to weaponize our own minds against us. We call it neuropolitics.
Neuropolitics. Unpack that for us.
Think of it as the deliberate application of cognitive psychology to governance and media. It's a strategy designed to bypass your rational long-term thinking and hit you right in the short-term emotional centers.
So the goal is to make you react instantly. Emotionally.
Before you have a chance to connect what's happening now to any kind of historical context. And the most powerful tool for this is what's called conceptual neutralization.
Okay, that sounds serious.
It is. You take fundamental terms like secular, conservative, liberal, and you systematically empty them of their original complex meaning.
You hollow them out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And once they're meaningless shells, you can weaponize them. You put them into these false binary oppositions to polarize everyone. You create this idea that, for instance, a secular person can't possibly have a conservative view on family.
Which is absurd, but it creates conflict.
It creates easy emotional emotional division that relies entirely on short-term outrage, not coherent thought. And the symptom is this terrifying social amnesia. We forget last month's successes and, more importantly, last month's failures.
So if the short term is being manipulated, what's wrong with our long-term memory?
It's a structural problem. The past has to be structured. If a society frames its entire history as one long story of being invaded, betrayed, and looted, well, the collective memory will be defensive and negative.
So that's the negative template. What's the alternative? What does a healthy, positive framework look like?
The positive structure is one of a great civilization, one that built multiple states, that made massive contributions to world science, to art, to culture over 1,000 years. When memory is built on a foundation of achievement, it becomes a source of resilience.
Not just a list of grievances.
Exactly. And that's foundational to national identity. The sources point to a definition of nationalism that's inclusive, one that encompasses all the constituent parts of a country.
That sounds very different from some other historical models.
It's the opposite of, say, a colonial model, which defines itself by what it excludes. An inclusive definition makes sure everyone is part of the collective memory. It prevents that fragmentation and internal conflict we were just talking about.
Which brings us down to the individual level, to the human memory machine itself. Isn't it a paradox that we are biologically programmed to learn, yet our education systems often feel like they're designed to make us fail?
It's a massive paradox. Look at language. How can 25 years of formal education fail to teach fluency in a second language when a 5-year-old can naturally pick up 6 languages at home?
So the system is fundamentally at odds with how our brains are wired to learn?
Completely. And we tend to accept these limits. We say, oh, I'm just bad at languages, or I'm not a math person. But the extreme examples of memory just blow that idea apart.
You're talking about the child who memorized pi to nearly 68,000 digits?
Or the card players who can memorize the order of dozens of decks of cards. These aren't superpowers. It's trained practice. We even have the neurological evidence for it.
So you're saying training can physically change the brain?
It absolutely can. The evidence is measurable. Studies on London taxi drivers who have to memorize thousands of streets showed they had a physically larger hippocampus.
The hippocampus. That's the memory center of the brain.
It manages both short and long-term memory. They are literally building a bigger, stronger memory muscle through practice.
That changes everything. The key takeaway for you, listening, is that your capacity for learning isn't fixed. It's a muscle you can train.
Which brings us to the method, mnemotechnics, or what most people know as the memory palace method. This is the formal system for training that muscle.
Okay, this is the practical part. Let's break it down. What are the core practices?
The first, and maybe the most critical, is conceptualization. You have to link an abstract idea to a concrete physical image.
So if I say justice, you need a picture in your head.
Exactly. Maybe it's a set of scales or a judge's gavel. If you can't mentally see it or draw it, you won't remember it. You're giving the idea a physical hook in your brain.
Okay, makes sense. What's number 2?
Second is association, or relating. When you learn something new, you have to be immediately connected to something you already know.
So like a new word in another language sounds like your dog's name.
Perfect example. Use the dog to remember the word. Your brain doesn't store information in a vacuum. It builds pathways. You're just helping it build them faster.
Got it. And the third?
Comparison. Using opposites. Hot and cold, big and small. You learn a concept better when you also learn what it is not. It gives your brain contrast, and that makes the information stick.
It sharpens the definition. Okay, fourth is restructuring.
Or reframing. Look, if you can only repeat a sentence you've read, you don't really own the idea. But if you can take that concept, say, the helical path, and use it in 5 totally new sentences to describe different things,
Then you actually understand it.
then you own it. You're moving it from rote recall into flexible, long-term memory.
And the fifth, the final ingredient, is emotionalization.
This is the secret sauce. Any information that's tied to a strong emotion is almost impossible to forget.
Right, the anecdote about the woman who remembers every detail of an outfit from 20 years ago during a traumatic event, but not what she had for breakfast.
Exactly. Her memory isn't better. The context was emotional. Our education systems, our collective narratives, they need to find ways to emotionalize core information to make sure it's retained.
So how do we scale this up? How do we take these individual principles and build a true societal memory?
We have to appeal to what's called the reptilian brain, the oldest, most basic pattern-seeking part of our consciousness. And you reach that part of the brain with visuals, with cinematography, art, powerful images.
Let's use the case study from the sources. A nation that accepts millions of refugees. That's a huge challenge, but it's also a massive opportunity for soft power.
It's a perfect test case. If a state is going to take on the very real risks of a huge humanitarian effort, it is absolutely critical that they strategically shape that effort into a global narrative.
This is public diplomacy 101.
And it's so often missed. Look at the contrast with the Danish police officer. That single emotional image of him playing with a Syrian child. He went viral. It created a powerful, positive narrative for the entire country overnight.
That is the power of engineered memory.
So if a state is making this enormous sacrifice, it can't just hope the world notices. It has to fund the films, the plays, the books, curated by respected international figures that tell that story. That's how you ensure the effort is seen as a major contribution to humanity.
And crucially, the sources say this has to be done now. The memory has to be built contemporaneously.
You absolutely must keep a diary of the present. If you wait 20 years, other political or economic actors will come in and rewrite that history to suit their own agenda. You have to build the culture in real time.
So to bring this all together for you, the listener, societal development really comes down to two things. First, individual discipline training your own mind using these memory practices.
And second, a clear, proactive state strategy for building a collective narrative and projecting soft power.
That's the formula for continuity. A nation has to cultivate its history, celebrate its artists and scientists, and actively engineer a sense of pride and understanding.
You can't just leave it to chance.
So here's the final thought. If memory truly is the measure of a civilization's development, what current monumental events in your own life or in your nation are you documenting and emotionalizing right now to make sure they are remembered and not left to be manipulated and forgotten a decade from now?